Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our virtual education program. My name is Kara, and I am one of the education and support coordinators at the Alzheimer's Society. Because of COVID, we're not offering our face-to-face programming, but instead we are delivering services through the Zoom platform. Please feel free during the presentation to ask questions using the private confidential chat box addressed to the Alzheimer's Society of Nova Scotia host. If you don't see it, you just have to use your mouse to hover near the bottom, and there should be a chat in the middle. So you can just click on that and it should pop up for you. Remember, however, though, to press enter so that we can get the message. Questions will only be seen by ASNS, the Alzheimer's Society of Nova Scotia, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. So our audience members today consist of people living with dementia, care partners, people who want to learn more about Alzheimer's disease and other types of dementia, and healthcare professionals as well. A reminder that the session is being recorded. Your microphones and your cameras are turned off so that your faces and voices will not be part of this recording. So we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes of a presentation, then followed by questions. So today, I actually have the privilege of introducing to you Raylene MacDonald. She's our guest speaker today. Raylene will be speaking to the topic of talking about capacity. Raylene is a recently retired registered nurse after a long career in mental health nursing. She worked for the past 15 years as a community mental health nurse on the geriatric psychiatric outreach team. And Raylene actually was the first nurse to become a designated capacity assessor under the Adult Capacity and Decision-Making Act in Nova Scotia. So I will hand it over to Raylene. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kara. Just the beauty of doing Zoom from home. Just as we were starting, somebody came to the door and rang the doorbell. So I did a really quick sprint. So I'm just going to talk about capacity today, and I'm going to do a case presentation, which was a really common scenario that I would encounter when I worked in the community. So just to begin talking about capacity, it's really decision-making capacity, really as for those who are healthcare providers, really part of every encounter you have with a patient, you are doing an informal capacity assessment because you're trying to determine whether or not the patient understands what the health situation is and their options for care. So every time a nurse is doing discharge, planning and education, trying to teach somebody about how to care for a wound, for example, or how to take their medications, every time a care coordinator with continuing care is in someone's home and they're trying to explain to them about how their home care is going to work, or about the supportive care allowance and so on, they're really making a judgment about how well that person is understanding what they're saying. We know because of the demographic shift in our society with the aging population, issues about capacity assessment are becoming more and more common. When I first started with the geriatric psychiatry outreach team 15 years ago, we would occasionally have an issue about somebody's capacity. It would come up as a question, but it was really apparent in the last few years how this was becoming a really much more common to have questions around someone's capacity. And people are more attuned to it now. We know besides with the aging population, comes an increased incidence of dementia and other coexisting medical problems. And we know that declines in a person's day-to-day functioning can coincide with a loss of decision-making skills. So, which would often, sometimes at least will require a more formal assessment of decision-making capacity. So I'm going to just do a case presentation here today that I assume that people in the audience, at least some of you, that this kind of situation will be very common to you. It was certainly very common in my work. So Mary is an 89-year-old widowed woman. She lives alone, and her only child, unfortunately, is deceased. And she does not have a power of attorney. She has some health problems. She has diabetes. She has a history of a stroke, and she has high blood pressure. Mary is refusing home supports. She's refusing home care. She's not taking her medication properly. People notice that her appearance is more unkempt lately, and she's not eating well, and she's had a number of emergency department visits for falls, and she hasn't been attending her doctor's appointments as regularly lately. She has a niece who is concerned, but she was unable to convince Mary that she needed more care. After a fall, Mary is transported to the emergency room where she is diagnosed with dementia. And they make that diagnosis based on evidence of both cognitive, or memory, cognitive and functional decline over a number of years. They did not assess her capacity in the emergency room. But Mary agreed that if they let her go home, that she would agree to having home supports in place. Her niece thought that this was a reasonable plan, and so she is discharged home. Her niece is now acting as the substitute decision maker, and that's based on a provincial list. There's a provincial list for substitute decision makers that starts with your spouse, and then your adult children, and then goes to siblings and then other relatives. And in this case, the highest person on that list was the niece. So let's talk about capacity a little bit. The capacity, there's a lot of definitions of capacity or decision-making capacity. You'll also see it referred to as mental capacity. But it's the ability to both understand the information that's relevant to a decision and to appreciate the consequences of that decision. A person should only be deemed to lack capacity when it's been really firmly established that they lack the ability to make decisions, or if they're at serious risk because of their incapacity. So we don't take it lightly, and we don't assess everybody's capacity. Why is it important? It's important because it is a fundamental human right to make your own decisions. So an adult with capacity has a legal right to make the decisions about a whole host of things. They have a right to consent to a treatment or an act or care. They have the right to withdraw or refuse that care. And they have the right to manage their own affairs. Capacity is always assumed. We always assume that any adult has capacity until it is deemed otherwise. What's important for you to remember is that in any capacity assessment, the burden lies on the capacity assessor to prove that the individual lacks capacity. It's not up to the individual to prove that they have capacity. So when the question comes up about having somebody's capacity assessed, there's a trigger that happens. Something changes, something happens, and it kind of calls into question the need to have the capacity assessed. It's often like an event or a circumstance around health that might potentially place the person or others at risk. So it could be a fall, it could be a hospital admission, it could be wandering, an event or circumstance that seems to be caused by impaired decision-making, or an event or circumstance that necessitates investigation or problem solving and possibly action by a healthcare professional. So it might be something that's happened that their healthcare providers maybe referred them to the geriatric navigator or geriatric psychiatry or geriatrics, or for other assessments like an OT assessment or something. Something has happened and changed. So some more specifically around that, somebody might have noticed a significant change in behavior. somebody might have noticed that their cognition, their memory, and other aspects of cognition are not as good as they used to be. They might notice that there's a significant change in the person's ability to make decisions, or a significant change in their risk tolerance. Maybe someone that was very, very cautious before is taking actions that are a lot more risky. Significant changes in their wishes and instructions. The person may be unable to understand different options for solving problems, or somebody might suspect that the person is being taken advantage of. And any or all of these things would call into question whether or not the person is having a problem with their capacity. There are 4 components of capacity that are pretty universal. It starts with the ability to communicate a choice. And this could be in a number of ways. So, for example, if you were unconscious, if you had taken ill and you were unconscious, you cannot communicate a choice. And so by virtue of that, at that time, then you lack capacity, decision-making capacity, because there's no way you can communicate a choice. Being able to communicate a choice can be in a number of different ways. It could be verbally, or it could also be with the use of aids like maybe a picture board or a communication board that a speech language pathologist would use. It could also be communicating a choice by virtue of blinking your eyes or squeezing someone's hand. The next component of capacity is the ability to understand the relevant information. So when, for example, if a pharmacist is explaining to someone about a new medication that they're starting, so how would the pharmacist know whether or not the person understood that? So a clinical test is to ask them to repeat what they understand of what you just talked about. So they have to, in order to do that, to repeat it, you have to remember it long enough to be able to repeat it. The next component of capacity is to be able to appreciate the consequences. How does this information relate to you? What are the consequences of making this decision? And what are the consequences of not making this decision? What could happen to you if you make this decision or if you don't? And the last component of capacity is the ability to reason. And so this is really looking at the process of making a decision. How did the person come to this decision? What process, mental process did they use? Can they explain that to you? It's also important to remember that it's okay. It doesn't mean that a person lacks capacity if they're making unwise decisions. A person with capacity has the freedom, the legal ability to make unwise decisions. I could decide today that the nest egg that I have set aside for my retirement, that I want to take every cent of that and I want to donate it to a certain cause. I want to donate it to the SPCA because I love animals. Well, it might not be a wise decision because I'm going to need that in the future because I'm now retired, but I'm free to make that decision because I have capacity. So there are different domains of capacity, and when you're looking at doing a capacity assessment on someone, you're looking at a very specific question, okay? So some of the most common ones are, the most common one I think that I have sort of been involved with are personal care decisions. And those are decisions about, having supports or not having supports at home, whether or not you're going to agree to going into long-term care, and other sort of health decisions like that. The second most common, I think, consent to treatment. Anytime we're engaged with the healthcare system, and we go to the emergency room, we have a consult for a surgery, or an investigation, that there's a consent involved. That's the healthcare provider is making a judgment that you are able to consent to that treatment. The next most common one is financial, and assessing whether or not you have capacity to continue to manage your finances. There are other domains of capacity, including, for example, whether or not you're capable of assigning a power of attorney, whether or not you are capable of changing your will or making a will, and so on. We have in Nova Scotia the Adult Capacity and Decision-Making Act. I'm going to talk about that more in a moment, but that recognizes what we call 9+1 domains of capacity, including like where the person lives, what kind of care they receive, who they associate with, even participation in recreation, employment, and so on and so forth. The +1 is any other domain that's deemed appropriate. Capacity and decision-making capacity is all around a specific decision. So in Nova Scotia, it is legal for a physician or a psychologist or a designated capacity assessor listed on the Public Trustees website to assess capacity. When it comes to a physician, it can be any physician. It does not have to be a specialist. It doesn't have to be a geriatrician. It doesn't have to be a geriatric psychiatrist. It can be any physician. The primary care provider, the family physician, is always the preferred person to assess capacity, because presumably they will have known the person over time. And so they have a longitudinal history, and they would have seen changes, if there were any, in that person over time. I've only ever seen probably twice in my whole career that I saw a capacity assessment done by a psychologist. It may be done much more frequently. That's just the only observation I've had. And the designated capacity assessors listed on the Public Trustees website, of which I am one, are only able to assess capacity in very prescribed circumstances. And I'll talk about that again in a moment. The important thing that I want you to remember with this is that anybody, whoever assesses capacity, whether it's a family doctor, a psychologist, or a capacity assessor, they're just giving an opinion on capacity. The only way you can really be legally deemed to lack capacity or be incompetent, and those terms are used interchangeably, is in a court of law. In most cases, that it doesn't go to that. In most cases that I've been involved with, when a physician gives an opinion on capacity, that's really all that's necessary. For example, a continuing care, if they're assessing somebody and they feel that this person is probably going to need long-term care, the person doesn't agree to that, but they think that their judgment is impaired, their decision-making capacity is impaired. A physician assesses capacity and fills out Form 1 under the Personal Directives Act. There's a number of acts that I will talk about later, but that's all that's needed. The continuing care will take a copy of that form, and they will proceed with the long-term care assessment. They don't need it to go to court at that point. So capacity is not black or white or all or nothing, because as I said, there's so many different domains of capacity. If you have lack capacity in one area, that doesn't mean you lack capacity in another area. So for example, if somebody is having some cognitive changes, maybe they are at a point where managing finances is complicated for them now. Maybe filling out their income tax form is too difficult, or managing their investments or whatever is too complicated, and they can't keep up with paying their bills and all that stuff. They might lack capacity for financial decisions, but they may still retain capacity for personal care decisions. So capacity depends on the complexity of the decision being made. For example, it's a much lower threshold to decide on whether or not you're going to get a flu shot than it is to decide on whether or not when you have cancer, whether or not you want chemotherapy or radiation. Having a diagnosis of dementia does not mean that you lack capacity. And it doesn't mean if at some point you do lack capacity, it doesn't mean that you lack capacity in all areas. Being older does not mean that you lack capacity. And we have to be really sensitive to that and be alert to that, because, I've certainly seen circumstances where it's assumed in a healthcare environment, but it was assumed that a person who was in their 90s lacked capacity when that absolutely wasn't the case. So we have to be alert to that in both ways, that some people might lack capacity, but also that they retain capacity. So I want to talk a little bit about the Adult Capacity and Decision-Making Act in Nova Scotia. This came into law on December 28th, 2017. The Public Trustee's Office, which is under the Attorney General's Department, trained the first capacity assessors in June of 2019. This replaced a really outdated act called the Incompetent Persons Act. This was something that was inherited from the UK. And under that act, when you were found to lack capacity, you lack capacity for everything. So you lost all your decision-making capacity. You had to have a guardian appointed, and that guardian became the guardian of everything. So that person decided your personal care, your health care, your finances, and so on, where you lived, everything. Under that old act, the Incompetent Persons Act, you had no right to a second opinion without your guardian's permission. And it did not recognize that capacity can fluctuate. And so this act was outdated, and it needed to be replaced. So the Adult Capacity and Decision-Making Act, I'll just call it the ACDMA as we go forward, is for adults who cannot make some or all decisions for themselves. So it's not just for older people. It's not just for older people that might have dementia or other impairments. It's for all adults. So it could be an adult with a significant learning disability, a severe mental health problem, a brain injury, any other neurological condition. The important part about the ACDMA is that, again, it assesses different domains of capacity. And it allows another person to make some important decisions for an individual if they lack capacity. Under the ACDMA, so if, I'll give a scenario. So if you have an adult in your life, a family member perhaps, that you're concerned about their capacity, they don't have a power of attorney, so they have never signed a power of attorney. And so they have no one to legally speak for them. You can then request a capacity assessment under the ACDMA, and you can apply to the court to become that person's representative, okay? So you have to engage a lawyer. And so once you have the capacity assessment, the capacity assessor has to file an affidavit. Affidavit has to go to a court. You as the person who's applying to be the representative have to have a vulnerable section check, which is a criminal record check and a child abuse registry check. And then you also have to post a bond of 1.25 times the value of the individual's personal property. That can be waived if it's a very low ceiling, but only if there's financial incapacity in that individual. That's to prevent somebody from taking financial advantage of somebody. So there's a lot of checks and balances there. In a previous virtual presentation with the Alzheimer's Society, lawyer Jessica Lyle presented on estate planning. And she talks a little bit about this. And according to Jessica, she says that this process would cost on average about $4,000 to $5,000. So applying to be somebody's representative is not something that you would take lightly. If it goes to court, and if granted, the representative is given the authority, but only to act in specific areas. For example, if it was financial incapacity, just finances, and so on. It also can be supported decision-making. So somebody can help the individual make decisions wherever they are able to do so. One wrinkle is that if a person doesn't have a power of attorney, the only way to manage the person's finances is under the ACDMA. So it's really to everybody's advantage to plan for the future, have a power of attorney. And if you have somebody that you trust, maybe an adult child or somebody else, that to be joint on your bank accounts. If they're not joint on your bank accounts and you are found to lack capacity, they don't have any access to your finances, and they would have to go through this process. So let's go back to Mary. So initially, she allowed her niece to help. She allowed help from home care, and she was allowing her niece to help her manage her money a bit. But now she's at the point where she's refusing help. She won't let home care in the door anymore. She's continuing to fall, and unfortunately, in a recent fall, she broke her arm. So her niece contacted Mary's family doctor, and the doctor assessed Mary and said that Mary does lack capacity for personal care decisions, but financial capacity was not assessed. And that it may be perhaps that Mary didn't ask for that to be assessed, or pardon me, that the niece didn't ask for that to be assessed, but financial capacity wasn't assessed. So what are the components of capacity that might have been pertinent to Mary? Did she have the ability to communicate? Yes. And I will say, if any one of the 4 components of capacity are missing, then the person doesn't have capacity. So was she able to communicate? Yes. She can speak, she can hear adequately, she's able to respond. Was she able to understand? Yes. When she's given simplified explanations, she can understand. But unfortunately, she only retains the information quite briefly. I'll also notice that when I did the original presentation about Mary's case, I did not comment on her memory testing. Memory testing is an important part of a capacity assessment, but memory testing alone, there's no memory test or cognitive test that will determine capacity. Does she appreciate the consequences of a decision or a lack of decision? Well, Mary says, well, I have a bit of diabetes, but it's not really a problem. She doesn't really think that not eating properly, not taking her medication is causing her any problems. She feels fine. Can't imagine what that's doing. She was informed in the past that she had a diagnosis of dementia, but she doesn't think that that's impacting her life in any way. And she doesn't need any more help because she feels she can do everything for herself. So she has also an unrealistic view that she's going to get better and that the neighbors will look out for her, although that hasn't been the case in the past. She has no realistic reason to assume that. Reasoning. So we're looking at how she sort of came to these decisions. We're kind of asking, why did you make that decision? And are you making good decisions? Does your illness, does the dementia affect your ability to make decisions? Or is there anything else influencing your decisions? And we find that Mary, unfortunately, she lacks insight. She doesn't recognize her deficits. She's forgetting and minimizing the impact that this is having on her day-to-day life. Her responses are really inconsistent. There's no consistent way that she can explain why she is making the decisions that she's making. She can't, in a consistent way, explain why she's not taking her medications, or why she decided to say no to home care. There was no clear problem-solving process that was evident in an assessment of Mary. And it's important to note also, when you're doing a capacity assessment, you're really taking in information from a whole variety of sources. The interviewing the person is the gold standard for sure. but you're also looking at the person's medical history, and you're talking to people that have known this person in the past. So family, of course, that they've known this person, they know what they were like in the past, and anybody with a longitudinal history, like the family doctor. I have found I've gotten invaluable information from the pharmacists in home care. Home care, when they're going into somebody's home day after day, they have a bird's eye view of what's going on a day-to-day basis. And that information is invaluable. So once that information is done, the capacity assessment's done, the niece contacts the home care on Mary's behalf. We now know that she lacks capacity, so they can proceed with getting home care back in place. And they will likely proceed at some point with getting her on a assessed for long-term care, and maybe getting her on a wait list for long-term care. And I will say that when agencies like home care, when they realize that this person lacks capacity for personal care decisions, they're really good about kind of working their way in and kind of finagling and talking the person into allowing a bit of care. They're not going to just take a no for an answer. They're going to be respectful, but they're going to know that they're going to have to work around that. At this point, Mary's niece becomes aware that some of her bills having been paid, and that Mary took out a second mortgage about 3 years ago. No one is joint on her bank accounts, and she does not want to let her niece continue to help with finances. But Mary does not believe that, or pardon me, the niece does not believe that Mary can manage this on her own. So she might need an assessment of financial capacity. So in this case, Mary could then apply to become Mary's representative, in which case she would need an assessment of financial capacity. So months later, home care is no longer enough support, because Mary has started wandering away from home, and her niece is very concerned. The police have had to be called twice now because Mary has wandered, and they had to help find her. So a referral is made to adult protection. Adult protection decides that this is a case of immediate and significant risk from a permanent and irreversible condition, namely the dementia. And they go to court for an order of protection to have Mary placed in long-term care. I want to note that adult protection has to abide by a set of laws. The Adult Protection Act came into being here, the current one, in 1989 and again in 2014. Adult protection involves abuse and neglect in cases of immediate and significant risk, but not in cases of financial abuse. The Adult Protection Service has to abide by the letter of that act, and they can only intervene in the case of an adult who lacks capacity. So, there's many times that we refer folks to adult protection, and they may be living at some degree of risk, but until they have their capacity assessed and they're deemed to lack capacity, adult protection cannot intervene. So I'm going to end it there and entertain any questions that you have. I hope that was helpful. It's really a brief overview, and I'm interested in what you have to say.
Excellent. Thank you, Raylene. So I'm just going to jump into a few questions because we do have a few. Getting back to the case study that you had mentioned earlier, Raylene, one of the questions was about Mary. If the client's capacity was not assessed, how was the niece made the substitute decision maker?
Well, there's a provincial list for substitute decision makers that the hospital has. And so when somebody doesn't have an identified substitute decision maker, they automatically go by this list. So if I have a power of attorney for healthcare, if I have a personal directive, I have a personal directive, and I name you, Kara, as my substitute decision maker, that takes legal precedence. If I don't have anybody designated like that, then they go by the provincial list, which is number one, the spouse, Number 2 is the adult children, and then the adult children are all considered to be on equal footing. So if you have 5 children and one of them you don't feel would be a good decision maker for you, they're not really going to take that into consideration. The caveat is, though, if you have to have you have to have contact with that person within the last year. So if you have someone in your family that you're estranged from, or let's say you have a spouse, but you've been separated and you're estranged for a number of years, they would not be considered on that list. So going down the list, Mary's niece was the closest relative, and she becomes the substitute decision maker for healthcare.
Great. So it's like a hierarchy of, yeah, as far as the placement is concerned. Excellent.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's a good description. Yeah.
So here's another big question. What is the difference between capacity and competency, which you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, so those terms are used interchangeably, but I've done a lot of reading on this lately. Really, the term competency is really more of a legal term. So you'll hear lawyers use the term competency for certain things. And as well, you might hear that in a court proceeding. But I tend to think that the language around that has changed. And remember, we had the Incompetent Persons Act that has now changed to the Adult Capacity and Decision-Making Act and the Personal Directives Act and whatnot. So while we recognize that the terms are used interchangeably, they mean the same thing. But you will still hear people use both terms. I hope that makes sense, but really they mean the same thing.
Right, and competency is something that's more of a legal issue as opposed to...
Well, I think it's a legal term.
A legal term.
I think it's a legal term.
Legal term.
I don't think it really means anything different.
Okay. So if a person is found to lack capacity, are they still able to live in the community, or does it mean that they require 24-hour care?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And it's something I saw all the time in the community. You can lack capacity, but if you have adequate supports, there's absolutely no reason that you can't live in the community in your home. You just have to have the sufficient supports, and you have to accept the supports.
Right, and I think that's where it gets into capacity, is when a person begins to refuse the support because they've lost the ability to reason, to know, and they're maybe overestimating their abilities to live independently at that point.
Yeah, exactly.
Is a determination by an assessor, is a determination by an assessor that a person lacks capacity permanent?
Yeah, so not necessarily. So, capacity can fluctuate. And so capacity can fluctuate. And as anybody, I want to talk a little bit just about dementia. Look, we know anybody who's been involved with somebody with dementia knows that they have good days and bad days. And they have sometimes better times of the day and other times that are not as good, right? So that person's capacity fluctuates within a day, right? Within the run of a day. Everybody has the right to be assessed. If they're going to have a capacity assessment, they have the right to have that assessment at the optimal time of day for them. And when you're assessing capacity, one of the questions I would want to know is, whether or not they're aware that they're more confused at different times, and what they want to do about that. Like, for example, aside from dementia, let's say somebody had cancer or some kind of illness where they required narcotic pain relief. And they were aware just after they've taken their pain medication for an hour or two, their head's really foggy. So in that case, they might say, look, that's not the right time for me to entertain complex questions. So we're going to arrange to look at decision-making at different times. The other thing is that sometimes people can lack capacity for a medical cause, for example, like if somebody has delirium. So somebody can have delirium and be very confused, and at that time lack capacity. Sometimes delirium takes a long time to clear. And so if capacity is fluctuating for whatever reason, the person may need to have capacity reassessed, and they might even need it reassessed several times. I definitely have seen people regain capacity in some situations, not when it was just a case of dementia, but oftentimes when it's something else superimposed on that.
Right.
Like delirium.
And it's interesting through InfoLine, actually, Raylene, if I can get you to stop sharing your screen, I'm going to flip up our InfoLine number there so that.
There we go.
All right, I'm going to share my screen here if I can find the share screen. Let's see. Here we go. Sometimes we'll get calls on InfoLine, and people are really sort of wondering whether or not. They talk about their family member having good days and bad days. And we know, depending upon whether a person's had a good night's rest or, maybe they've had a particularly busy day, their capacity may not be as good as it would have been the previous day if they didn't have a lot, on their plate, sort of thing. So it's understandable to see why a person would have capacity in one area and not another. One of the questions that I have here is the process of a capacity upsetting? Is the process itself upsetting or difficult for the person that's being assessed?
So, I've been involved in lots of capacity assessments because I work as part of a team. And when I worked in healthcare, it would be the geriatric psychiatrist assessing capacity at that time. I can honestly say I've never seen a case where it was extremely difficult or upsetting for the person. I think by the time we get around to assessing capacity, things have been going on for a while, but it's generally really handled in a really respectful way. I would also say that one of the things I didn't mention is if anybody is going to have their capacity assessed, the individual needs to be told that that's what this interview is about, that you're in some way, shape, or form, they need to know they're having their capacity assessed. It might be coached in terms like there's a question around the decisions you're making about home supports. And so I'm going to ask you some questions to figure out whether or not you need more support around those decisions. So it's coached in a really respectful way. Yeah.
And I'm thinking for the individual who's being assessed, it's probably a good idea to have somebody there that they trust, like a care partner sitting in with them. Is that possible? Can a care partner sit with them during that process?
Well, that's a really good question. So you might have the care partner there at the very beginning, but you should not have the care partner there for the actual capacity assessment, just because you're looking at the risk of whether or not another person is unduly influencing the individual. So you really have to give them the ability to speak freely. Yes, so you would ask a care partner or anybody after the consent is obtained to ask them to step out.
Okay. If a capacity assessor's opinion is the person lacks capacity, is this legally binding?
You really can't be, the ultimate legal decision is if it goes to court and a judge declares that you lack capacity, right? But in actual practical terms, if somebody assesses that you lack financial capacity and you take that capacity letter to the bank, then they'll work with you. So if somebody lacks financial capacity, they take a copy of that form and the power of attorney document naming them as the substitute decision maker for finances. I think that's all you need. I really haven't seen it. It's not very common that somebody actually goes to court. It may get more common with the ACDMA now. We haven't seen a big uptick in that, but we'll see. And that act is up for revision starting this time next year. So we might see an expansion of that.
Okay. And then, so a final question then would be, does a diagnosis of dementia automatically mean that the person lacks capacity?
No, it doesn't. No, and people can retain capacity, especially early on in the dementia. So you have to approach it with a clean slate, bearing in mind that they have dementia, but also bearing in mind that they can retain capacity for certain things. And the lack of capacity doesn't mean lack of rights. Lack of capacity doesn't mean that the person can't still decide certain things on their day-to-day basis, what they want to eat, who they want to visit with, what they want to wear, what kind of activities they want to participate in.
So if somebody wanted more information about capacity, the suggestion would be to visit the website for the Public Trustee Office.
Yeah, I
And
think
it's
that's a good start, yes.
Yeah, and so you had that, I think, on one of your slides here. And maybe I'll flip back to those resources. It's just back here.
I think it's the other way, Kara.
Oh, is it the other way?
Yeah. The very end. Yeah, the Public Trustees Office of Nova Scotia has a really good website. And people actually call the Public Trustees Office as well and for information.
Oops, not finding it. Hold on, we'll just flip through here.
Maybe I left it off.
I think it's back. Oh,
no.
I have your old one, so that's probably the reason why it's, yeah. That's
right. So if you Google the Nova Scotia Public Trustees Office, that website.
And I think Beth has actually added it to the chat as well, so people can get it from the chat. And so it's specifically looking at the Adult Capacity and Decision Making Act from the Public Trustee Office, website, which is great, good, really great information. Raylene, we really appreciate your knowledge and being able to really break this down for us, because some of us have questions around capacity, especially if a person is diagnosed. We know that a person has capacity to make decisions in a variety of different areas. And so to be able to hear that from you as an assessor and somebody who's worked in seniors mental health for a number of years, it's really great for you to share that with us. So thank you very much. And I just wanted to let everybody know as well that if you wanted to give us a call, our info line number is up here to talk specifically about your own certain situation, personal situation. The other thing to note as well is that Raylene's presentation today on capacity has been recorded, and we actually host it on the Alzheimer's Society of Nova Scotia YouTube channel so that you can watch it again, and feel free to share it with some friends and family who may also have some questions in and around capacity. So thank you all very much for attending today. I think we have a poll that Beth might be popping up in just a second here. We'd like you to take that poll. And yeah, we're going to leave the line or the chat pod open a few minutes. And thank you all very much. And thank you, Raylene, so much for coming in today to talk about capacity.